How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Elier Gonzalez here, and let's explore of this thing called side effect, which is another tool in our toolbox provided by React, right? So one of these additional tools are React hooks, right? Where the idea is that we can hook on into the React internals to achieve something specific. Whether it is we want to store specific information across our entire application and keep track of that, we use now the user state. Or if we want to store some piece of information, uh, instead of using now components to do that, we use now hooks, right? Or custom hooks. So one of them is the use ref or the use ID, which is useful for uniquely now store its values in our applications globally. Why do we even care about this? Well, for example, for a small or for a small and very convenient use case, which is attaching now a label to an input, right? So whether it's an input checkbox, greater buttons, or text, email, or password, or any other type of input. But the idea here is that when the user click on the label, now it focuses on that input, right? And especially if you have multiple forms in a specific page, well, you want to at least have some global uniquely identifiers, right, to solve these specific problems. And then I look at the rules of hooks, which is if you want to now use some specific things that React provides, there's some rules to go with. First, these React hooks must be in their component, in a React function or in a JavaScript function. Okay? And second, they must be put at the top of that. The reason is, well, I'm not going to dive deep in today's video, but it's relevant to ordering things. Uh, so then look another hook, the use ref, which allows us is to store piece of information that we don't want to that we keep across renders. Okay, so here you can store now primitive or objects, but most of the time we use this use ref is to hold now the reference of that particular HTML tag, and therefore is to apply or run some specific functions. So for example, on a video, all right, which is something that we also see how you can actually use most common examples on React, right? Using is this use ref. But again, for video or for audio, when you want to get that element first, and then when the user responds to that, when you detect any change, you now get that element and then run some specific instruction. Let's say play a video or pause it or you name it, right? But that's the whole point of this, and also is for focusing the input. Right? Anytime that the user now loads this particular page or UI, we want to always is focus the element to that, right? So, and also looking at the thing, especially of immutability and what immutability are. So because now our state, anytime that we now create is, or anytime that a core loop is triggered, which is from the user state, I call that the core loop, right? It creates now a new state of the application, right? A new snapshot of this, and this new snapshot live in a different place in memory. You might wonder, why do I even care about that? Right? It's because anytime that you are now is re-rendering an application or considering that thinking, especially when I look at things called as side effect, all right, using now the use effect, which this is the way how now you can schedule functions to React to run after the render happens, right? So because sometimes you do want to do that after the render is done, and then you want to synchronize to external system. Let's say, hey, I want this to now fetch some data or read some data from a local storage, or to also interact with the DOM state. Perhaps I want to uh, now access to the navigator, which is the user agent identity and state. All right, and this navigator, well, it allows me to is the tag if I am logging or log out, right? So if this computer have access to the internet or don't, among other features, right? But anytime that I need to synchronize with an external system, web API or a server API, most common use cases, now I do need is to do that in some places, right? And this is why now the use effects kicks in, which is what we're going to look in today's video, right? Let's get into this. So there is a lot of things to cover here. There's a lot of things to cover. Yep. And I think this will take me some time here. Mm-hmm. Mm.
So far in this course, over the past couple of modules, we've been talking about this thing that...
Let me see if I already took some. There, you got it. Exactly. So first, I look at what the use effect is, right? And the use effect, anytime that we need to synchronize with a piece of information in React with other systems, for example, web API, server API, and use effect, use effect hook is the tool, right? So our use effect run after every renders. So we can schedule a function that synchronizes with an external system, right? And then you have now some gotchas with the strict mode, which is going to run your effect twice for highlighting potential issues. Okay, good, good. So yeah, that's pretty much this as it is, right? So anytime that you want to synchronize with this and then update now the document, for example, right, document.title, we can see that as it is. Not sure if this actually works in other CodePen, right? So if I put it now here in the CodePen, but now this CodePen will have is, oh no, let me go back here and let me create now. No, really? Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. But the other is I do want to run now is a playground React app. Okay, that's quite convenient. Go back. React playground. Oh, they're using is confetti. Mm-hmm. Uh, in React strict mode. Look at this. How is this going? Does it increase here? That'll be a good way. No, because this has to be is yeah, this has to be there. That's fine. That's fine. No problem. That's fine. That's fine. That's fine. So a couple exercise, right? So logging a particular value. Mm-hmm. Logging a particular value. So logging a particular value, right? Logging a particular value. But here is that hey, I just want is to render is this, right? Render a particular value. And there are several alternatives to do so, whether if you're using useEffect or on the handlers, right? Okay. Or the handler, right? But so one of the cool thing of this is that do not use if inside of your useEffect, right? So notes, right? Notes. You can say like the notes. Uh, do not add conditions to useEffect, right? And again, this is not because I say so. It is because the React Dev team recommend like this, right? Exactly. Avoid logic inside of effect. Okay. So avoid logic inside of effect. So avoid logic inside of effect. Not because I say so, because this is You can take a look at the reactive. All right, again, getting myself familiar with how to use this. And if you choose to use now a hook, that's a function that will run no matter what, and it will always continue to evaluate that condition, which there's nothing wrong. But if you have now several of those functions called in different components, and those components now are triggering that or that scheduled task, so you don't want to do that, especially if your application have a lot of components and and all of those components are using that, or they need to access to that piece of information. The TLDR is that avoid to put logic inside of that, right? And instead, all right, and instead, just use your effect for handling should run because the component was displayed, okay? And then you use now event handlers to set the state for that, which is in this case is now this one, right? So instead of doing this, which is a natural inclination, you just say, hey, let me wrap that functionality here, okay? And I'm going to now set JSON to submit here, which is this. Set JSON to submit to this. And let's apply the same criteria as in an example before, right? So here, the analytic post should remain in an effect. Exactly, the post should remain in an effect. This is because the reason, this is because we are sending some piece of information, all right, like analytics, all right, but the event with here, the registration or sending the piece of data when we respond to user event is happening at the function here, at the handler here. So this is okay. So this is quite two scenarios, convenient to a scenario. Sending a post request, right? Okay. So whether depend of your use case with this use effect, right? If you do need to send anytime this component is mounted or changed, no, anytime this component is mounted, okay? So this is when you do this kind of thing. This is useful for the scenarios like reading piece of data locally, or for sending some piece of data to a analytics service. And then when the user, and when we detect a user response, or when we detect a user event, let's say form submit, now it's in the handler where we're gonna send is that piece of data. But again, this is a way of how you can now synchronize with external, how you can synchronize your React application with external data. Okay, all right, okay, makes sense. So avoid logic inside of effect, and use effect is used when we want our React application to synchronize with external system, or vice versa, right? So whether it's the piece of information, whether it's a source of the truth is on the server and we want to sync our React app, or whether it's our source of truth is on the client, and then we want to synchronize with the server. But wherever the source of truth happens, is you want to sync that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. It is all about the source of truth. I'll be right back. I'll be right back. All right, and we are back. So this is okay. So now, so things started to make a lot of sense, especially as I explore and as I make sense of this additional tool in our tool set, right? In the toolbox, which is not only is the additional hooks, right, that are allowed to engage to certain specific behaviors. So the most common one is the use state to store this piece of information, but also is for another one, like, hey, I do need to have a global uniquely identifier in my entire application. That's what we use now, use ID, for example, and the use cases. But sometimes I do need is to actually grab an HTML element and then do something about it, right? This is what we do. But sometimes I do need is to synchronize with external systems. A more tangible, or in English, in plain English, is sometimes I need to read some data or write some data. Oh my God, this makes a lot of French sense. Holy hell! Sometimes I need to read some piece of data locally from my local storage, or so read some data or write some data on that, right? Okay, and depend of that kind of operation, this and depend of that kind of operation and what this component wants to do, now the use effect can be useful or not. All right, so for this case where you want is to log in a particular element, right? Avoid logic inside of effects. All right, create separate effect. Use effect is used when you want or when you want your React app to synchronize with external systems or vice versa, right? Because uh, exactly. So depends who holds the source of truth. Okay, you want to synchronize with it. That's what it is. It can live on the client or on the server, right? So for example, form data or form data collected form data collected from the user and sync with yeah okay and sync with so for example, from data collected from the user and sync with this is a very interesting example. So for example, from data collected from the user and sync with a database, right? Here we use is a we use a function handler. Another example is to send data to analytics system, and here we send And here we use another is to send analytic system is to send data to analytic system on a page, and here we use a effect. We use effect, right? Okay. Another thing is um, create a uh, create a use effect per synchronization step. All right, or per synchronization process. Okay, which is what we did here in this particular example. Hey, I do want is to only detect change when these things happen, right? So for example, like this, you say, oh, it makes a lot of sense. But again, is what do we want to do? Oh, I do just want is to log in the user when this specific piece of information change. So you can use now an effect to do so. And without passing any arguments, you are saying that, hey, I just want this to run this on the initial render, right? But in any case, we got this one, right? Is this just for clarity, for convention? This is what I do want to do, right? Because we need to import that from react.useEffect. Don't add any logic to this, all right? And always remember what you want to do with this effect. And in my case is, hey, I just want is to synchronize with some external system to get this. So for example, only when the email is set, right? I just want is to now log in the email, right? So here what it's doing with this use effect, right, is, or the effect link rule is to tell now the use effect hook. This is the piece of information that anytime that it changes, anytime that there is a new snapshot, right, aka in this case a new snapshot is a new piece of information, right? Anytime that there is a new piece of a snapshot from this email, I do want is to execute this function, which is this arrow function here. So it makes a lot of sense. Makes a ton of sense. So anytime to only wait, what the French does? This is not supposed. Oh, it's because I console log here, right? I console log here. Right? Yeah, yeah, you got it. So but it's only going to render is on the email, right? Only on the email, which is good. If you want to now synchronize with another piece of information, and you do this as well, right? So far so good. And I do think that it is useful for us to create now separate synchronization process as it is, because now it'll make much more sense to read this and what this thing is gonna do. So when this change, okay, I wanna do this. When this change, I wanna do this. Some of them might say, hey, when I have an array of dependencies, this is what I want to execute. If any of those dependency generate a new snapshot, all right, then this is what I want to do. Okay. Okay. Makes a lot of sense. Exactly. You can either run this a single effect or two independent effects, right? Mm-hmm. But again, it's part of the recommendation and something that I actually now um mm-hmm, they covering is this specific use cases, right? Keep in mind that effects are typically used to step out of your React code and synchronize with external systems. This includes browser APIs, third-party widgets, network, and so on. If your effect only adjusts some state based on other state, you might not need an effect, which is something that it mentioned here. Which is why they mention is that, but the whole point of this is to develop this intuition of this, what this piece of information represents, right? You don't need effects to transform data for rendering. You don't need effects to handle user events. All right. You do need effects to synchronize with external systems. For example, you can write an effect that keeps a jQuery widget synchronized with a React state. And you can also fetch data with effect. For example, you can synchronize a search result with the current search query. Keep in mind that Model Framework provide more efficient built-in data fetching mechanism that writing effects directly in your component. To help you gain the right intuition, let's look at some common concrete examples. But you do need effect to synchronize with external system. For example, you can write an effect that keeps a jQuery widget synchronized with a React, any third-party libraries. You can also fetch data with example. Why this is important? Because remember, depend of what is the source of truth, then you want to synchronize that piece of information, right? Whether it's by using an effect to notify that source of truth about it, or from read that piece of information when you see fit. Oh, and then you have locally persistent state here, right? In this locally persistent state, let me actually is now. This is more like a recommendation. Okay, locally persistent state. Okay. So now here, when this component is mounted, you are passing now to this hook to read to do this thing at the first render. Exactly. This is not this won't work. And it's because this store value needs to get that read that information. Window dot local storage dot get item. All right, which is dark mode. You're gonna read that particular state initially and then parse that into a value here. If this is undefined, all right, Okay, give me now false. If that exists, whether it's true or false, provide me with that value. Mm-hmm. 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 One more thing, the solution share here won't work if you're using server-side rendering, because what happened here is that you are now loading is this application is on the client side, right? This application is going to be rendered is on the client side. Mm-hmm. An alternative solution, whether if you wrap this into its own function, right, and then set the items here, instead of using now a use effect for that to actually read that or to set that here, we use now an event handler for that, which is part of the sending a post request. Okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, ass motherfucker. Mm-hmm. Effect link rules.
So if I had $1 for every time.
Oh, effect linked rules. Do we have this? Effect linked rules? Effect linked rules? Hmm. Separating event from effect. It is okay to suppress a dependency linter instead. In the existing code base, you may sometimes see link rules suppressed like this. AES link disabled next line. React hooked exhausted depth. We recommend never suppressing the linter. The first downside of suppressing the rule is that React will no longer warn you when your effect needs to react to a new reactive dependency you introduce in your code. In the early example, oh, this is a linting rule. In the early example, you add URL to the dependency because React reminds you to do it. You will no longer get such a reminder for any future edits to that effect if you disable the linter. This leads to bugs. So that is not what you should do. Why is that? Because remember, at the end of the day, this is keep tracking now is this is keep tracking is reactive data. Okay, data that is creating is a new snapshot on every render. So when that renders, and if that value changed, so now React knows behind the scenes what function needs to trigger here. And it will have all the dependency that it needs to. But in this case, say, no, I don't know what the French do you mean with number of items. Okay. Here's an example of a confusing bug caused by suppressing the linter. In this example, the hand move function is supposed to read the current can't move, right? As you can see here, right? Mm-hmm. The hand move, the handle move is supposed to set the can move, target check, the input, okay, and now handle move, right? This is set can move, and then the handle move, diggy diggy, which is a function that is going to now receive is this client X and client G, right? So on pointer move, you get this. This is interesting. This is another event here. Pointer move. Oh, it's not exclusively to mouse, but with more features. This event happens when whether or not any pointer button are pressed. They can fire at very high rates depending on how fast the user moves this pointer, how fast the machine is, and what other tasks and process are happening. Pointer move. On pointer move, which is come from the mouse event and UI event and event. All right. So now I'm adding is an event listeners that is responds to this and set the position here, right? So what happened here is that anytime that these components mount here, like this, it will not only run this, but it will ask for this handle move, right? Or this another handle move. Since now this effect needs is an array of dependency. So this is part of this hook, all right? I want to schedule this task after every render when something changed, when the things change. So this won't work. Let's see. Okay, initially it will work. When you click here, it will continue to do so, right? Why is that? Because despite that we set that, the pointer here or the position is not being clear, because now we haven't removed this. The problem with this code is suppressing the dependency linter. If you remove the suppression, you will see the effect should depends on handle move function. This makes sense. Handle move is declared inside of the component body, which makes is a reactive value. Handle move is at a inside of the component, which is a reactive value. Is declared inside the component body, which makes is a reactive value. Every reactive value must be specified as a dependency. Okay, so anytime that you define is an identifier here, right, inside of your component, this is called a reactive dependency or reactive value, which makes it a reactive value. The author of the original code has lied to react by saying that the effect does not depend on anything, where the truth is that that particular function is a reactive dependency, or it's a reactive value on any reactive value. This is why React did not resynchronize the effect after CanMove has changed and handle move with it, because React did not resynchronize the effect. So for example, if you change now this handler move, right? So now what it's gonna do is to call that on every render. It's like makes it the handle move function makes the dependency of the useEffect align change on every render. Move it outside the useEffect callback. Alternatively, wrap the function handling it its own. or whether you do is this, right? Which is another one. You can define its function. Okay. And now this will work as a charm. It will throw now an arrow here. Oh, it's because it can have access to the set position function. And handle move is no longer now this. So look at this. Right? This is why React did not synchronize with that, but because React did not resynchronize the effect, the handle move attached as a listener in the handle move function created during the initial render. During the initial render, can move was true, which is why handle move from the initial render will forever see that value. If you never suppress the linter, you will never see problems with stale values. Okay, stale values. With useEffect event, there is no need to lie to the linter, and the code work as you will expect. So you're saying, hey, I'm going to wrap this effect event, all right, that'll be now that I'm indicating to React to this specific function on move, is gonna get rendered. That it's gonna trigger now that functionality. This doesn't mean that useEffect is always the correct solution, and you should only apply this to the line of code that you don't want to be reactive. The line of code that you don't want to be reactive. Okay. So hey, I don't want to apply this line of code, this functionality. I don't want to make that line of code to be reactive. Okay. Read removing effect dependency for other correct alternatives to suppressing the linter. Okay, but let's go with okay, chill. You know, chill.
I've seen this lint warning for this rule, the React hooks exhaustive dependency rule. I would be a very, very wealthy person indeed. I'd probably still make courses like this because I like making courses, but I certainly wouldn't have to. It's a very common lint issue to stumble over. And if you Google how to solve this problem, you'll likely discover blog posts and Stack Overflow answers that teach you a special magical incantation you can use to silence the warning. It's a comment that reads ESLint disable next line. You type these magic words and the warning goes away. But before you start applying this all over the place, you should know that this is a bad idea. This is sort of like the ostrich who sees danger on the horizon and solves it by burying their head in the sand, right? We're not actually solving a problem here. We're silencing the warning about the problem.
Like
and this warning is actually really important. Like, React is trying very hard to protect us from an extremely confusing situation. And to help me explain that situation, I've created a counter extremely really important. Like, we're silencing the warning. Head in the sand, right? We're not a bridge who sees danger on the horizon and solves it by burying their head in the sand, right? We're not actually solving a problem here. We're silencing the warning about the problem. And this warning is actually really important. Like, React is trying very hard to protect us from an extremely confusing situation. And to help me explain that situation, I've created a counter style application. I have my count state variable which is initialized at 0. I use it in a paragraph to show the user what the count is, and then I have a button they can click to increment the count. And then I have this effect, and the effect logs the value of count. I've included a dependency array, but it's an empty array, so it doesn't have any dependencies. And this is a problem because it means that this effect will not rerun when the count variable changes, right? We're saying that the effect should run after every render if one of these dependencies change, but there aren't any dependencies, and so we are not listening for changes on the count variable. What this means is whenever this component re-renders and we produce new count variables that point to the new value of the state, this count variable will grow stale, pointing to a previous version of the state. Now I know this is very hard to understand. I know this stuff quite well, and it still hurts my brain a little bit. But I'll show you what I mean in a couple of different ways. First, let's actually go through it in the code. So suppose I click this button, we call the setCount method, we pass it the number 1, this triggers a re-render, and so we rerun this code again. We create a new count variable, and it gets assigned to the number 1, which we pluck from React, right? React has this internal state, and it provides it for us, and we assign it to this new variable. We then rerun all this JSX, except now count is equal to the number 1. We then hand this description to React. React updates the DOM, and we see our fancy new UI. And that happens every time I click this button, right? We re-render the component, producing a new count variable that points to this new number, whatever that number happens to be, and then we use it in the UI. Each time this component renders, though, we decide not to rerun the effect because none of the effect's dependencies have changed. And what it means is that this count variable right here is still referencing the initial value of 0, right? The initialized state variable, because this only ran after the very first render. To explain this another way, if we look again at my memory visualization, now we see that we have a count state variable that is initialized at 0, and that's the value used in the first snapshot. Suppose we click the increment button a few times. Every time we do this, we generate a new snapshot, which has a new count variable, which points at a different value. Now we're using the most recent snapshot to generate the UI, which is why I see the number 3 in the UI, but the effect has only run after the very first snapshot, which means the effect only has access to this count variable. It is genuinely bewildering when we have a situation like this where this count variable holds the number 3 and this count variable holds the number 0. Like, they're the same variable. So I realize this is a brain-bending thing. It's very difficult to understand. But it just has to do with the fact that we have many count variables, one for every single snapshot, and they've become desynchronized, where this count variable is stuck in time, frozen in the past, still referencing that first count variable. To fix it, we have to include count in the dependency array. And what that does is it means that this function will be rerun every time the count variable changes, meaning that this count variable and this count variable will always be the same because we're rerunning everything after every single render, or at least the renders where count changes.
Effect leans rule, but it's talking about the stale data that React needs to keep track in order to run this task. You can skip that by using this React useEffect event, where you say, hey, this reactive data, this identifier, this variable that I'm putting here, that I'm registering in our component, is not part of the reactive. It's not a reactive value. So aka now I can use that there, right? In rare case, we need to access the fresh version of the state variable inside an effect, but we don't want the effects to rerun whenever the variable change. We'll see how to tackle the situation later in this model, where we talk about more about the state values, which is here, right? And running mount. And this is part of the patterns here. This is part of the pattern. Running on mount. Okay. This is the common pattern of using useEffect. All right, which is anytime that you need to synchronize something from scratch, for example, an input, just do this, right? And then it's gonna do that for us. Great. Right? Foggle. Right? So you can do this. And then you have now subscriptions. And those subscriptions is to say, hey, I do want is to rerun this, all right, when this when I get into this. So I'm going to synchronize with this. I'm going to pull, I'm going to define now that piece of logic here, and that piece of logic will be now executed
0, but y is equal to 2
of that. Exactly. Going to define this piece of logic here inside of that.
204. So we update the UI with these new values, and then we run the effect again. And this is where the problems start, because I'm not actually running this code again, the code to update the mouse position. I'm running this code again, right? I'm adding another event listener. And so at that moment, I now have 2 event listeners registered with the JavaScript engine that are both going to call this function when the user's mouse moves. And every single time I see these numbers updating, it means I'm adding another event listener, and they're starting to stack up like hotcakes. This method, the window.addEventListener method, we can think of it like starting a subscription, where by running this code, I'm starting a long-running process. I only want to do this work once, the moment the component mounts, and then this long-running process will handle all of the mouse move events. To fix this, I can add an empty dependency array to my effect, which means that this code only runs the very first time this component renders, and it ignores all subsequent re-renders. This is the way it works with a ton of different subscriptions, whether I'm starting an interval, or opening a WebSocket connection, or using something like resize observer. I want to start the process once, and then the process sort of takes care of itself, updating the state as the events happen. I have a diagram that might help explain this, where I have sort of all of the different renders that are pictured here as these vertical parallelograms. And we see that in the very first render, x is 0, y is 0, and after that render, we run the effect, which starts this long-running process. Within this process, whenever the user moves their mouse, we call setMousePosition with whatever the new value is, which triggers a re-render, and we do this every single time the user moves their mouse, but we only have a single long-running process. Now, if we didn't have that empty dependency array, and if we were running the effect on every render, we'd have a situation like this, where after the first render, we run the effect, which starts this long-running process. When the user moves their mouse, we trigger the re-render, but then another effect runs, and so we start a second long-running process, and then a third long-running process, and they just stack up and up and up, totally out of control. And so this is a pattern that it's worth becoming familiar with because it's so common, where we have some sort of subscription or registration that needs to happen immediately after mount, but then we need to make sure that it doesn't happen over and over and over again because the subscription is long running.
Again, part of the pattern of using now effect here. The pattern of using an effect here. Okay, where here you can say, hey, let me now define is this function here, right, that I'm going to attach to the, that I want to, I'm going to attach to this subscription that I want to subscribe to this event, right, and I'm gonna call it handle move, right, and here, because I know that this will be attached to that event listener, so what I can say is, hey, I want to later on set mouse position, all right, and be updated those values with the proper data as it is, right? By just saying x will be now e dot client x, and g will be now e dot client in G. All right, and because I want to run this specific task once the component is mounted, it can be also useful for when the page is mounted. All right. Then I want to is do this, right? Which is window dot add event listener, right? Which is mouse move, right? And then on mouse move, this is what I want you to do here, right? Mouse move, handle move, and there you got it. That's right. And this is the event, and so on and so forth. It says that window dot add event listener here is not a function. Add event listener. There you go. And now when the component is mounted, now it attaches this event listener to this. So it's gonna schedule this. It already run this task. So now instead of stacking all of them, it's just adding is one. So far so good, and this is great for any resizing, for example, mouse move or resize window, or any other subscriptions that you need to listen for. Okay, and however, we know how to add an event listener, and then how can we get rid of that? So exactly, this is part of the exercise here. Window dimensions, and here it already it won't keep track of that. But what we know is that we know how to do this. All right, which is again anytime that we need to synchronize. Here, useEffect, right? I want to run is only once, and this is what I want you to run. This is the function that I want you to run here, right? And that is, I do want is to set the window dimension, right, of the width and height. But the question is that where I'm going to get this? Well, this will come from a particular event. That event, it'll be the resize, I think it is, window resize, windows resize event. Okay. So this resize, right? It has is that an event, right? It is called resize, right? It is using now the resizer observer API, which is great, right? So report change to the dimension of an element context or border box or bounding box of an SVG element, right? Okay, so based on this, right, if I say resize and I get this event, what is the anatomy of this event, right? Yeah, what is the anatomy of this event, right? Well, the resize event fire only for the window nowadays. You can get resize notification for other elements using resize observer API. But again, what is the value? this event is not cancelable and does not bubble. In some early browsers, it was possible to register resize event handler on any HTML listener. However, resize events are only fired on the window object. It by returning is that, but again, what is this? If the resize event is triggered too many times for your application, see window.onResize. But again, it's a generic event type. So the anatomy of this generic event type is this, right? Do I have access to that? You know, this is instance property, instance methods, prevent, stop propagation, reload pages. Target element. It is an event, but it's not describe what the French stove is an event here, or the shape of this event. Okay. This is why I prefer the TypeScript here. This is why I prefer the TypeScript. I don't need to log into that. In any case, I'm gonna receive some sort of event that here's when I'm going to update that. This is now resize. Handle resize, right? Handle resize, and again, I don't know what is this. What is the value that I'm gonna get from this? I don't know. I am in the dark. I am in the dark. I am in the dark. Okay.
Whereas the dimensions of the window are always available on the window object. Next, I want to...
Okay. Yeah, you can get the dimension of that. You can say, hey, window inner the width for the whole window, and for whether it's a width and the height. All right. And then now I can looking at the specific event, window.add event listener, so resize, and this is what I want you to do on the first render, right? I am subscribing one, okay, and when the window detects this thing, when I subscribe to this event, now it's going to actually modify that. Only in this case, it's modifying is the width. But this is a common pattern here. This is a very common pattern here, right? And the other is too steep. This is no more like using the interception observer API. That'll be all for this video. But take care. Bye bye.